It was a cold February evening and Scott was driving back home with his wife Helen. There was a sense of happiness in the air as they did because today was their anniversary, and they'd made a promise to each other that every year, on the 2nd of February, they would go back to where they'd had their first date, and this year was no exception. The couple had enjoyed their night out and were driving home so they could cuddle up on the sofa and watch a film together with a glass of wine. It was a tradition they'd always enjoyed, and it never failed to instill them both with a feeling of nostalgia, as they would reminisce about when they got together over the meal. After a wonderful evening, Scott was driving the couple back. They'd almost made it home when, suddenly out of nowhere, something darted across the road, causing Scott to swerve and lose control of the car. He tried to stamp on the brakes as hard as he could, but the ice on the road meant he skidded, and they ploughed into a tree. There was a horrendous sound of screeching tyres, which was soon replaced by the sound of crumpling metal, as the car embedded itself into a huge oak tree at the side of the road. The couple were launched forward, glass shattering into their faces as they were propelled from their seats, nearly sliced into by their seatbelts. A few minutes passed before either of them made any attempt of movement. Helen had just about regained consciousness and managed to phone 911 to get an ambulance out to them. She hurriedly told the operator what had happened, that they'd been involved in a car crash and that her husband wasn't breathing. She told them where they were, and before they knew it the ambulance had rushed them to hospital, but unfortunately the crash proved fatal. For the next 2 weeks before the funeral, Helen was inconsolable. It was as if she couldn't process what was going on, and the last thing she had any memory of was that night. But as she stood in the rain, looking at the headstone in front of her, that day she made a vow that every year, on the 2nd of February, she would go back to the grave and pay her respects to the love of her life. But on the 10th anniversary, she noticed someone else was approaching her in the graveyard. At first she thought they were just looking at another grave, but out the corner of her eye she saw some movement behind her. As they came over and stood by her, they didn't say anything at first, but after a few moments of quiet reflection, she heard him utter something under his breath. "Excuse me, can I help you?" she asked, a little put out by his presence next to her. But the man didn't reply. It was like he was ignoring her. He walked over to the grave and looked at the flowers which had been left. He then placed some white roses by the grave, which made Helen pause for a second. They were certainly not rare flowers, she thought, but she'd never seen any there before. He walked away, crying his heart out as he wiped tears from his eyes. There was something odd about him, like he felt familiar for some reason, but she couldn't for the life of her work out why. She walked back over to the flowers and picked them up. They were beautiful white roses. They'd always been her favourite flower, and not many people had known that, so she placed them back neatly. But she was just about to walk away when something on the headstone caught her eye. She never really looked at it before, but as she looked down she noticed the date. It said, the 19th of November 1975 to February the 2nd, 2009. A mixture of confusion and anger bubbled up inside her. She couldn't believe it had taken her this long to realise they got his birthday wrong. But as she was about to storm off, she noticed some moss had grown on top of the headstone. As she rubbed it off, nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. She tumbled back, horrified. Helen was now looking at the whole gravestone for the first time in 10 years. As she did, it read, "Here lies Helen Armstrong, cherished by her family and friends, beloved wife to a devoted husband, Scott. Until we meet again, November the 19th, 1975 to February the 2nd, 2009. That instant she realised the man who had brought the flowers to the grave was her husband. She'd barely recognised him. After all, it had been 10 years since she'd last seen him. She tried to run after him, screaming his name, doing anything to attract his attention, but nothing worked. He just walked towards the car in the car park and drove off into the cold spring air. Helen suddenly found herself on an unfamiliar street, next to the car that Scott had driven away in. When he got out, he walked down a short path, bordered by neatly kept shrubbery, to a dark blue front door, which opened, clearly expecting his imminent return. He was greeted by another woman and 2 young children. They all came out to him and gave him a huge hug as he slowly walked inside, clearly distraught from the day's events. Helen slowly walked back to the cemetery, but as she stood there, looking down at her own grave, she realised that she needed to move on, just as he had. As soon as that thought crossed her mind, everything went black. But only for a moment, and then the face of a doctor came into view, and 2 smiling faces welcomed an almost brand new life into the world. That was Groundhog Day. And if you enjoyed that, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, because every week I'll be reading another original horror story that'll get under your skin. So stay tuned for the next creepy story, and remember, it's not just dreams that come true, so please, don't have nightmares.